Good morning. Today we're going to be talking about using a geographic lens to understand U.S. and world history, and we're going to be focusing specifically on how we can use the C3 framework to help us analyze issues in history. Now, the C3 framework really, even though it was developed to help states create new standards, really helps us think about how we want to work with our students and how we want to approach different types of issues. So, what we get from the C3 framework is that any issue in history can be analyzed using the four dimensions of the C3. And I really love the way they're visually shown here in this inquiry arc framework. So, the first dimension of the C3 is helping students understand what are the questions that we're asking. And more than that, what questions do they have about this particular topic? What do they know? What do they not know? What do they want to know? And we're going to be doing an activity today to help students develop questions at the very beginning of an inquiry. And then in the second area, we go to our disciplinary lenses, and that's where I picked up to the content for today's title. And the different disciplinary lenses might be civics and economics and geography and history. And then we read and we write and we pull that all together. So any issue that we're going to be looking at, we can look at it with these different lenses, and each lens is going to show us a different aspect of that problem. And there's different activities we can do where we can divide students up into different groups, and some groups can take the civics perspective and another an economics perspective and the other geography and the other history, and then they come together at the end and share their inquiries. And by combining those different lenses, we get a more complete picture of how that event came to be and what its influence might be on the world. In the third dimension, we get to the concept of checking sources, and we want to understand there specifically this notion of evidenced versus parochial information. The fourth area is communicating conclusions and taking informed action. So whatever the students are learning, how can they apply that? How can they communicate that with others, whether it's their peers, whether it's to the teacher, their parents, the community? And is there anything that they can learn or that they can bring to the community based on what they're learning? If we're doing a unit where we're learning about why vote, maybe can they create posters that get people out there to vote, or those types of practical applications? So the C3 framework really gives us a wonderful path through content. And what I've done is I'm riffing on that today, and we're going to look at a four-step process for working with students that includes each of these different dimensions. So what are those four steps? First, provide a short reading for the students. And of course, not something big and overwhelming for the students, but give them an introduction. And then once you've got that reading, we can use that to help them develop good questions. And we're going to be modeling that today. And we'll see a couple of short readings I brought, one from US history and one from world history. And what are the questions that we can develop? And I'll explain a little bit more about both essential and supporting questions and how those are going to play an important role in our explorations. Next, we map. And that could be getting students to, sort of physically create a map, and so they can see how things are connected. And then finally, the last one, connect. Can we connect something that they're learning to the contemporary world, to the world around them? Even if we're learning something from history, why does it matter to me, high school student A in such and such a high school or middle school? Um, what's the meaning of this, and how can it help us understand what's going on today? So that's really the four-step process: read, question, map, and connect. And we're going to model that for you this morning. So I'm going to pull an example. First example I'd like to pull from world history on African empires, and you can see how we organize a unit. I pulled this screenshot from one of our software-based programs where we begin with a reading activity. We move to several different types of mapping activities, then a writing activity, and then we have quizzes and even a presentation research project. So this really takes us through that four-step process and gives us some different tools there. But whether or not you have this particular program or not, you can, what I'm talking about today can apply to any content in any format. We're going to be focusing on the trade in African civilizations, African kingdoms. So let's take a minute to read through this reading. Once again, I wanted to find something that was short and that would provide an introduction for the students, but also not explain everything and get them to sort of wonder, well, what are the bigger issues going on here? So let's take a minute to read this. And so we can see that this is a reading about the civilizations and kingdoms that developed in Africa post-ancient Egypt. And we get all the way up to sort of the Middle Ages, 14th, 15th century. And we have these wonderful empires that are developing in Western Africa based on the growth of the salt trade and the gold trade, and just something that always catches students by surprise, that wow, people traded gold for salt. How could that be? And that should be one of the questions that we come up with. Now, I want to talk about two types of questions that we're going to ask the students to generate now. We'd like to ask them, after they do this short reading, to generate some essential questions and some supporting questions. Okay, what are essential questions? Well, essential questions are those timeless questions. They can't necessarily be answered. They're the big issues that a investigation really brings to light. And the supporting questions are questions that are specific about that particular time period. Well, I think the best way and we call them context-based, the best way to look at this is to actually dig in and try and develop some of these questions on our own. So what are samples of some essential questions that we might throw out there? Okay, so we did the reading, and here are some of the big, why do people trade? Okay, so this is one of those timeless questions, because while we're looking at it in the context of medieval Africa, this is clearly a big question that relates even further back in time and all the way up to the present day. What is the relationship between trade and religion? How does the spread of ideas influence trade? And I would do the converse of that as well. How does trade influence the spread of ideas? Does trade lead to greater or fewer choices for consumers? Okay, so how does that affect people sort of on the ground? What inhibits trade? So these, once again, these are timeless questions, and they could apply to any period, but they're coming out here. And what's nice about these essential questions is the essential questions are what's going to allow us to link to the present. And this is why this is an important activity to do with students. Whatever topic you're doing, whatever you're investigating, is for them to understand we're not just studying about something that happened 500 years ago in another continent that has nothing to do with me, that the bigger questions that we're asking do have things to do with you and do affect you today. Here's one or two last ones. Why are some items perceived as valuable? If we can go to our supporting questions, we remember those were context-based. So now we're going to be asking questions that come out of the content that we're presenting here on African kingdoms. So how did African kingdoms become wealthy? It had something to do with salt and gold. What items were traded in West Africa and how were they transported? What were the effects of greater wealth in the African kingdoms? We had these wonderful development of cultural centers like Timbuktu. So with that done, I might turn now to an atlas to give the students some background information. We're going to begin to make that switch to not switch to, but really the connection between the reading that we did, the questions that we're asking, and now we get some nice visuals in order to get just some background information. So here's just a 2-page spread from an atlas. Comes from the Nystrom Atlas of World History, and it further introduces the students to some of the key issues and gives them a picture of what things might have looked like at the time. Okay, so we can develop that information and we can use this to do an inquiry. Now, in our mapping history programs, the students use the Atlas pages in order to help them actually create a map of the period. So if we go in and we go into, say, one of our mapping programs, and this is using our software program for mapping world history, we had the students, this is a partially completed activity by a student who created the label for West Africa here, use the stamping tool to put the camel here that's transporting things across the Sahara Desert. We put gold bars here in West Africa, and then we've got coins in Egypt and Rome. And what we're beginning to see here is we're mapping the connections between um, West Africa and the Mediterranean basin, and how that was important for that medieval economy, and not only the economy, but how things developed in terms of, we get here, like I said, back in Timbuktu, I've got a little book icon stamp that I put onto the map here to indicate that this was an important religious and learning center. So you can do this with any type of map. You don't need the Nystrom World Mapping Program to be able to do this. Take any map, blank outline map, and have students map some of the key elements of what they've learned about in their explorations. And this helps them to situate history in geography, to understand where places are. We've got measuring tools. They should understand that in order to get resources from, say, Senegal, what's in modern day Senegal to modern day Egypt, it would have been a camel ride of, up to a couple of weeks across this very foreboding desert just to get there. And the idea that people made sacrifices like that and traded things like salt and gold at such great distances and through such great trials and tribulations really is a testament to the difficulties of the economy of the day. But what we've done now is we've done our short reading, we've developed questions, and now we've mapped it out so that we have an understanding about where things happened in space and time. And the next thing is we can go to something and we can ask a question, and we can take something like an essential question: does trade strengthen nations? And we can look at trade in a modern global context. And so we can make that connection. We're not just learning about medieval Africa to understand medieval Africa. That's important. But we're learning about medieval Africa because we want to understand, how did trade operate then, so that we can understand better, how does trade operate today? Okay, so here we've got, this is our couple pages from the Atlas of World History, and here's an activity that goes along with that, and we give students sort of not really a pro and con, but two different sides of how trade benefits and challenges people, how it can help them grow their economies and get things that they don't have by trading with others. I have salt, you have gold. I want gold, I want salt. How do we work between those two different elements? So making the connection to today really is what connects the students to the present. Now, here's another example that I brought in from US history, a short reading on the Great Depression and World War II. In this reading, of course, that's a lot in 3 paragraphs. But one of the things that's mentioned here is the stock market and the stock market crash and the Dust Bowl. And one of the things that comes from that is this notion of immigration and migration generally. So one of the topics from this first paragraph is this notion of migration during this period. And of course, you had a very interesting period in the 1930s where you have mass migration Not so much immigration coming from outside the country, though you do have refugee groups, refugees trying to get in from Europe as you have the rise of right wing fascism in Germany, and people are concerned for their lives and safety. So you have people coming from Europe, but you also have during the period of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl a mass migration of African Americans from the South to the North. You have a crash in the cotton economy of the South due to the boll weevil infestation. And so that affects a lot of farmers who are not able to support themselves on the land. They move north and to the Midwest where the factories are set up. And also just off to the left of this map, we have I've got a bunch of arrows that indicate with the Dust Bowl, you have a lot of movement to the west of the United States, so that students are understanding the nature of migration during this period and how that might come to affect United States history later on. So they're able to situate this, they're able to see the differences between the North and the South, they're able to understand the different economies between North and South and apply that in a map-based manner. So once again, I just want to reiterate our four-step process. We begin with reading a short passage, something that gives some students some background information, but leaves them wanting to know more, leaves them wanting to develop their own questions. Then we go on to them developing questions, and we provided a model for both essential and supporting questions. Then that they should create a map. In other words, they should situate that in geography. We use the Nystrom digital mapping tools from the Nystrom World program, but you can use any blank outline map and have the students mark up symbols and directions that things happened. But to understand where things were in relation to one another is going to be a very important skill that they can carry with them the rest of their lives. And then finally, we want to connect for the students, not just to something abstract, but to connect to today. And remember, it's those essential questions like what is trade? How does trade influence nations? Is trade good for nations? What's the relationship between trade and ideas? That we can always take and ask those same essential questions that came out of our initial reading and apply them to what we're learning about in today's session. So that is our four-step process for integrating geography as a disciplinary lens in history. I want to thank you for coming out today, and we really appreciate you showing up. Thanks very much.